everyone, and welcome back to yet another episode of the Shadow Realm podcast. It is great to be back here in 2021. We've got a great episode for you here today. Thank you so much for tuning in. We've been a little spotty in the last few months, but we're going to try and make this a weekly podcast from here on out. So definitely stay tuned for more of that. Today with me, I've got our team captain, Henry, back again. He used to be the main host of the podcast, and it's good to have you back, Henry. How you been, man?
Yeah, it feels good to be back. It's been a long journey since the last podcast, the last episode that I did here with you. And it seems like we were just getting to the thick of things when we did that episode with Shannon. And then, of course, we just took a little bit of a hiatus from the podcast. And it was kind of like a little bit of a dry summer, right, with Yu-Gi-Oh! So it feels good to be back. I feel like the format's starting to get good again. And I think it's a fun time to play Yu-Gi-Oh!
Oh, yeah, we've definitely got a lot of stuff to talk about in this episode. I'm particularly excited because we're going to be talking about trap cards in one of our segments today and how they've sort of taken the meta back over again. It's been a long time since we've seen trap cards played in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! And so that has me, a control player, very excited. Of course, we'll be talking about traps, and then we'll also have a segment about time and how you can use it to your advantage, and we'll have a little discussion on sort of there's been disagreements and a lot of toxicity around the time rules, and the fact remains that you can use it to your advantage whether people are like it or not. So we'll definitely be talking about that. And then, of course, as usual, we'll be closing out our podcast with a segment from Road of the King by Patrick Hoban. So I guess without further ado, let's get into it, because we don't have a lot of time here. We're recording on Zoom, and it cuts us off after 40 minutes, much like a
Yep,
Yu-Gi-Oh
40 minutes,
match.
and then we really get sent to the Shadow Realm. Then it's over. Yeah, I'm so excited to talk about Yu-Gi-Oh again. I really do have a passion for it. I have to tell you, Zach. I think that a lot of times the format gets stale and it gets boring, and it feels like you're just playing the same game over and over and over again, and it just gets a little too predictable. And right when you think that it's just mundane, you get a ban list, and then boom, you're back again. So I really like the new format. I'm enjoying it. I've obviously we're both on the Drytron train with the ritual cards and whatnot. I guess we'll get into that in a little bit, but I really like the format. I think the format has a little bit of everything. They have a combo deck. You have like a mid-range deck like Virtual World, and then you have the trap decks. So speaking of trap decks, there's a lot of traps in the format. So I guess we'll talk about that. Zach, why are trap cards good again?
Well, the answer might actually surprise you. If you ask me, I think that traps are big in the format because True King of All Calamities was not banned. And, hold on to your horses here. I actually have a good reason for this. True King of All Calamities is kind of an FTK against combo decks. Like, imagine this format without True King of All Calamities. Combo decks would still just be able to go off and make their huge monster boards. And with True King of All Calamities in the format, it actually kind of forces you to play a slower game. In order to not immediately die on the follow-up turn, players have started playing cards like Torrential Tribute and even Needle Sealing, which one of our team members, Grant, knows is a really big card in Duel Links. It's a card that I never thought would see competitive play, but trap cards are kind of the catch-all that stops you from dying when when a deck like this exists in the format where you can just shut off all monster effects. You kind of have to pivot to a different type of card to not die, and trap cards are some of the best ways to do that. The problem with trap cards in general is that you have to set them before you activate them. The only trap cards that have existed in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh for probably the last 5+ years, except for bomb cards like, Skill Drain, Imperial Order, except for those ones that are like truly a bomb. The only trap cards that have seen play have been ones that break the rules of what a trap card is supposed to be. Cards like Infinite Impermanence or Evenly Matched. Those cards basically bypass the rules of what a trap is in Yu-Gi-Oh! And so it's really cool for me to see trap cards that behave like trap cards back in the format, because there's this kind of unknown element to a trap card, right? That's what makes it a trap, is that it's an unknown piece of interaction that could come from your opponent. You don't know what they have. But when a combo deck makes its combo, it's kind of just like, okay, I'm going to build this board and you can see all of my cards on the field. Break it if you can. But with traps, there's a lot more like head games, and it's harder to play around traps, and that's one thing I really like about them. It adds that little bit of spice to the game. I don't know. What do you think, Henry?
So the reason why I think traps are good are twofold. I agree with you about True King of All Calamities because the format is just so shut down by it, along with the likes of Vanity's Ruler, and I guess you could argue also Orange Light in the Drytron deck as well. So you have a lot of interaction there with monster effects and just being able to play monsters. So it kind of opens up a gap, right, for traps and spells, spells that are being played like Droplets and Book of Moon. It's kind of crazy to see those cards come back, but they all kind of do the same thing, right? They try to interact with your opponent outside of using monster effects, and I think it's nice that they have come back in a way. One specific trap card that we were talking about at locals this past week was Crackdown, because a lot of people are using Crackdown against, whether they're maining it in a trap deck like Eldlick, or if they're or just siding it against Drytron. If they're playing Vanity's Ruler, you just crack down it and you just win. Like, you just take it, and there's not much they can do because it only stops activated effects. It doesn't stop the continuous effect of Vanity's Ruler to prevent your opponent from special summoning. So there's so many trap cards. Of course, we saw the likes of Ice Dragon's Prison take in full effect, really reaching about from $7 to becoming like a $40 card throughout the course of pretty much the last format or so. And that card is really good, especially against decks like Virtual World, even against Eldlick, whether you're playing the mirror match. It's really good. It's a 2-for-1 in a lot of instances, and a blowout. And the other reason why I think traps are good is because there are still some control decks where one trap could stop your opponent's turn, and there's still obviously Zodiac. So if Zodiac gets their normal summon stopped, a lot of the time they just stop. And there's also a Virtual World where both of those decks are very, very linear. Even though Virtual World doesn't really like normal summon reliant, they're very reliant on activating their spell or trap and having a name face up on the field. So if you can get rid of that name, they kind of just have a bunch of vanillas in their hand. So traps just interact very well. It gives your hand a lot of options. And it's a little bit of a balance, right, with Zeus in the format, because Zeus can just wipe out all traps, but Zeus can't be made turn 0. And that's really why traps are good, because you could go second and not really have to worry about a card like Spiral Sleeper. Because when Spirals was the best deck, they would summon Sleeper and they would be able to pop 2 by the end of your turn. So say you're an Altergeist player, which was one of the better decks when Spiral was meta, you would go second, you would pretty much lose. Like, there was nothing that you could really do. Like, set traps and pass, end phase, Sleeper, pop 2, standby phase, Sleeper, pop 2 more. Oh, you lose. There's no card really like that right now. Like, you have Zeus, but that cannot be made turn 0. It has to be going second, whereas you're really just trying to prevent your opponent from playing like any way to get to an Xyz summon, or have them reach their battle phase. So I think that traps are quite good. And I think what makes traps so interesting is that there are so many different traps that do kind of sort of the same thing, but also different. One trap that I personally picked up in the last week or two is Quaking Mirror Force. I think we haven't seen a Mirror Force in such a long time. And when Zoo is the best deck, or one of the better decks, and same thing with Virtual World, there was no counterplay to Quaking Mirror Force other than if you just have the Cosmic, like, or if you have the Harpy's Feather Duster or whatever. Like, there is no counterplay to it because every deck needs board presence. So if you attack with a board bow, Quaking Mirror Force, you lose everything. Like, you don't have a face-up Xyz monster, you lose pretty much the monster under the board bow, and you lose the board bow itself. So the cards aren't going to grave, they're not going to hand, they're not getting destroyed, they're not even getting banished, they're just putting face down. So there's so many spicy techs that literally come in and out of the format within like a span of a week. Like if Zoo's the best deck format, then maybe you play Quaking Mirror Force. If Drytron's the best deck for the next week, then you maybe play Crackdown. So there's so many different traps, and I think that's what makes it fun.
Yeah, man. Traps can fill so many different roles in a deck. Like I mentioned how they like stop you from dying. They're kind of like, your last Hail Mary to not die to a combo deck, but in a control format where it's really back and forth. Traps can fill a lot of different roles. A lot of it becomes like resource management and tempo management. That's another huge part of playing the game. It's like there are certain resources. Patrick Hoban talks about this in his book. There are certain resources that you start with naturally in a game that you don't like get more of unnaturally, like your normal summon, unless you're using something like Brilliant Fusion, which is now banned, or any other thing that like by an effect gives you an additional normal summon. You just get that one. So like you mentioned with Virtual World, if you are able, if they have to normal summon like Gigi, for example, and then you pop it with Dryden when they target it with Lulu, then the Lulu just stays in their hand, and then they're just behind so much. But traps kind of get you back in the game when you're playing that control variant of any deck, or if you're just like playing a control strategy in general, you can take things a little bit slower. I love the fact that in this format in particular, because in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, it's pretty much been like assemble the board, break it or you lose. And now it's like I'm not guaranteed to get OTK'd on turn 2 if I don't set up an unbreakable board. Like with Eldritch, you've mentioned, like it's enough to have Conquistador and just the Scarlet Sanguine. Just put a couple bodies on board so you don't die, and then like maybe have Dragoon as one negate, or like it's just really nice to not have to finish a game in 5 minutes. Like I remember back in the summer of 2018 when it was high Goki format. I watched matches that was literally person wins dice roll, and then they go, I have combo. Do you have hand traps? And then they'd be like, yes, I have hand traps. Do you have called by the grave? And then they'd show the called by the grave, and they just go to game 2. Like that is so toxic. That kind of combo format is just the least fun imaginable. Yu-Gi-Oh is supposed to be an interactive card game. And so I love to see interaction actually coming back into the card game, which sounds weird to say, even though we got cards like True King of All Calamities, even though we have Vanity's Ruler in the format, there's still so much interaction. And it really does come down in a lot of cases to who is the more skillful player, who manages their resources better. So I'm super happy.
Yes, I agree. And I think that Konami does this very strategically when they talk about ban lists. And I know that there are so many cards that people would like banned, starting with True King of All Calamities. And then when you go past True King of All Calamities, you probably look at all the other lingering effect cards like Abyss Dweller and cards like that. But I think that there are a reason why those cards exist. And obviously Calamities is probably slightly overpowered, but I think that you need some number of those crazy cards just to exist to slow the format down a little bit to allow these trap cards to come into the format. Because if True King of All Calamities didn't exist, let me tell you, there would be no virtual world, and it would just be Drytron versus traps. And usually Drytron wins that matchup, but then the trap decks tend to pre-side for Drytron, and it just becomes like a very like stupid very trivial format where it's like, do you have this? Do you have that? Like you were saying. So I appreciate cards like True King of All Calamities. I respect that people have to play around it. People have to main deck outs to it. And it really is one of those cards that does balance the format in a way. So I actually have a prediction here. I'm not meaning to make this like a banless prediction video, but I don't think that True King of All Calamities is going to get banned. I think eventually it will, but I don't think right away. It might go to 1, and you might see Virtual World get hit in another form. But I think that cards like this are left in the format for a reason. If Konami thought it was a problem before, they would have hit it earlier. This card's like 3 years old. So cards like this, I think, allow to go back to your original point. I think cards like this allow traps to be good. Same thing with Vanity's Ruler. So yeah, I agree with you. I also think that a deck like Eldritch already exists, so there's always going to be the best trap deck, whether it be Altergeist or Eldritch, whatever has the most oppressive archetype trap cards, I suppose. But in this case, there are really three types of decks. There's like the trap decks, the mid range, and the combo. And what's so versatile about traps is that it's good in decks that can interrupt in other ways. So, like you were saying with Eldritch, most Eldritch engines are playing other engines. So, whether you have Zodiac, where you have Dryden Pop, you also have the Threat of Zeus. And then there's also the version that plays the Evil Twins, which is a deck that's widely played at my locals, and you have to deal with the Link monster that pops on your opponent's turn. So that's always going to be a threat. And then they get to Abomination, and then they usually have hand traps, or whether it be with Dogmatica, they usually have Punishment and Flare, or Winda, whatever they might have. So it's not easy being a combo player at the moment, but then again, you have crazy cards like Zeus that once you get over those first and two initial, like whether it be Solemn Strike or whether it be Torrential, once you get past one or two of those cards, you usually just make Zeus and win. So it's pretty balanced, I would say. Like, trap cards are fair, I would say. They're good, they're not overpowered, but they're needed.
Absolutely. And again, you know me. I'm a Subterra player through and through. I am never going to complain to see more trap cards in the format. Although, interestingly, I think Subterras are actually very poorly placed in the current format. If I was to pick a trap deck to play that was not, like, say, Eldritch, I would probably actually go for Altergeist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Altergeist are very underrated as well. They always have, now that Multi-Faker's been at 3 for a while now, since that unban list that we had in June.
Right.
The deck is actually pretty decent. The one complaint I've always had about the deck is that the best cards in the deck aren't really searchable. Like, you have to hard draw, like the obviously Spoofing is not an Altergeist card, and the other traps you have to set with Marionetter. So it's really just a weird deck, but it can compete for sure. I think the deck is really cool. Of course, like, you have the Dogmatica engine, which can, by itself can set up a punishment plus sometimes a schism. So that's two traps right there, just off an Ecclesia and like any other like extender. So it's pretty relevant right now to play around traps. So I think because Harpy Feather Duster is at 1, and you have crazy cards like Lightning Storm, you have obviously 3 Cosmic. There's so many different ways to get rid of back row. You have Evenly Matched. So you can't really complain. I mean, these traps could pretty much, all be at 3. At the end of the day, Solemn Judgment's at 3. So, the sky's the limit with traps. But at the end of the day, they just still lose to the same cards. So they're very fair. I would say you have to prepare. Like, I lost in the finals at locals last Sunday to Stun. Shout out to my boy Kyle Christian, Mr. Macro. I lost to Inspector Border, Banisher of the Radiance, and the Moon Mirror Shield, and all those, and a bunch of traps. And it wasn't easy. I had one or two I had a Lightning Storm and a Harpy's Feather Duster, and it still wasn't enough. So sometimes it's just, how much can you match your traps with your board presence. And going forward, I see a bright future for traps, which I couldn't say about a year ago.
Yeah. Like I said, it's absolutely insane to think that traps have been considered, like, widely considered to be almost unplayable in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! And now suddenly it's like everybody must play traps to play the game.
Right.
One thing I
And it's
do
like,
really enjoy about them is that they extend the game. I hate games where it
right.
literally just ends on turn 0, but it does actually kind of segue us into our next segment, where we're going to be talking about time and the way that
Yeah.
the Konami sanctioned official time rules are actually, most consider them to be pretty toxic. But the fact remains, somebody has to benefit from them. And there is actually,
Right.
and I know that you have an opinion about this, and I pretty much agree with you that there is actually a way to take advantage of time in a way that, maybe doesn't feel so great because the rules just kind of suck. But there's a way to do it without being like, I don't know, it's not cheating or slow playing. There's actually a way to strategically take advantage of time. So I'm actually going to hand it off to you and tell me a little bit about your experience of playing in time, because I know you play Prank Kids a lot, and that is a deck that is like it's like it was engineered to win in time.
Yeah, no, with Prank Kids, listen, there's two cards in the archetype that affect life points, and that means if you draw, and any one could get you to the others. So you could draw one of, let's see, 15, depending on what build you're playing, how many plays you're playing. It's like one of 18 cards. So you are super. I think you have like a 93 to 90, like 6% chance of seeing one. So it's crazy. Like the once you get to game three with Prank Kids, it's a wrap most likely, especially if there's less than 5 minutes on the clock. So I do want to address this. I don't want to spend too long on the subject of just me personally, but because I'm making a separate video for it. But in the last 2 months or so, since we got Prank Kids Meow Meow, which is the all waited on Link 1 for Prank Kids, where it's making a one card starter for any Prank Kid, whereas before you had to open a polymerization plus 2 Prank Kids. So super easy to start the engine now, which is great. I love the deck. And unfortunately, it does come with the ramifications for other players of losing in time. And I guess it could say that it people say it could bring out the worst in someone if you're getting close to time and you're playing a deck that burns or gains life points, and you can take advantage of that. I think that if you slow play, I agree with that. It's not a healthy thing to have a bunch of slow players in the community playing Prank Kids trying to win in time. But I think that there is a fair way to win time strategically, and that is what I tried to do in the last format or so. Before I switched to Drytron, I was playing Prank It at almost every local, and I from the 2 week period of around December 3rd to around Christmas, I went to about 6 or 7 locals, between a couple of locals on Long Island, of course, Gaming Universe in Flushing, which just opened again, and we got, you know, I got a lot of flack for playing Prank Kids, of course, because of winning in time. But I never slow play. That's something I want to address right now, because a lot of people who I've beaten in that 2 week span, where I actually ended up with a record of 24, 2, and 1 tie. So I had 24 wins, 2 losses in that entire 2 week span, and 1 tie. And I probably won 6 or 7 matches in time, just naturally. But what I do have to say about slow winning in time, it shouldn't be synonymous with slow playing, because a lot of people tell me I'm a slow player, but the fact of the matter is that I play faster at a faster tempo and a faster speed than most players, most of my opponents. Now there are players that maybe are at the same level as me, where I take a moment to think about my play, that say, "Oh, come on, Henry, like I know what you're up to." But that's just them trying to take advantage because they want me to hurry, because they want to win in time. So it's really like, eat or be eaten. And it's sad, but the fact of the matter is I never intentionally slow played, and a lot of people don't like me about locals, to be flat out honest. People don't like me in the Long Island area. They don't like me because I won a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh lately, and a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh in time, and they know my strategy. But my strategy is not to win in time. Like, I'm playing an actual deck where I could summon a quick play Raigeki and Raigeki my opponent twice. So it's not like I'm playing a deck that just burns damage or just gains life points. I also play Mystic Mine in my deck, but I don't have to deck you out with Mystic Mine to win. It's just a part of my strategy where I gain resources while my opponent's trying to a field spell. So it's really like, who's preparing the best for these situations, right? So I set up my deck to play Mystic Mine, which isn't even particularly good in the format. There's a lot of back row removal with Chuke, with Conquistador, a lot of main deck back row like Cosmic Cyclone and whatnot. So it's not amazing, but I built my deck to simply gain advantage. I tag out monsters, I add monsters to my hand, I special summon, I link summon into whether it be Doodle or Bow Wow, depending on whose turn it is. I tag it out, I add more monsters into my hand, and my opponent still has monsters on their side of the field. So I pretty much invented, people give me credit for this deck list with Mystic Mine. I pretty much invented a lock where I'm constantly gaining resources, like hard resources, while my opponent's trying to just play the game. And naturally, since the games get longer, I am more prepared in these situations where it gets close to time because I naturally know the grind game. I'm more well versed in these scenarios than my opponent because someone who's trying to beat the format, they're not prepared for these alternative scenarios where they have to deal with a Mystic Mine or they have to deal with Prank Kids in time. So a master duelist will know how to, play against any situation. I think there are just so many players right now who are considered good in the community that just know how to do one thing really well, whether it be a virtual world player who's considered a pro player, maybe sponsored or whatnot, but all they know is how to summon calamities and pass. I think that when I play the game, I try to test every single person to see how they react to different scenarios. And unfortunately, getting back to the segment, time is one of those scenarios. So the person who is more prepared for every single scenario ought to win the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! And I don't want to win. I don't intentionally want to win exclusively these abridged Yu-Gi-Oh duels where it's just me winning in time, because really that's not a true test of resource management. However, at the end of the day, not every Yu-Gi-Oh match is based on resource management. It's just logistically you need to finish matches earlier than an hour. So could the time rules be revised? Sure, that's fine. I would probably win equally as much because most of these games I'm going first and I could make a board. But instead of me playing, my usual strategy of trying to set up a Mystic Mine or a Buster or I should say Battle Butler lock, I'm winning in time. So it's just alternative win conditions. And when you look at the great players like Patrick Hoban or Billy Brake, when you look at their deck profiles, they all had alternative win conditions. So I think that there's a fine line between slow playing because, listen, I think if you've been at a high stake tournament, we've all done it, and it's all been done to us. I've been guilty of it once at a regional qualifier, and I'm not proud of it, but I moved past it. And I said I'm not going to do that again. That was a bad move. You have to admit from your mistakes. So now I try to prepare myself for when I'm going into time. I'm going to play at a fair tempo where most of the time the judge is watching because I have like a reputation apparently. And I always play faster, if not the same pace as my opponent. I side deck. I'm always done siding before my opponent's done siding. I put the deck on the table. I say, ready when you are. And people call me a slow sider. So I'm not here to try to win people's support, but I did want to explain myself a little bit, and I think that if you can come into a locals or regionals, whenever we get those back, with a game plan for time, that's not you just slow playing and not committing an action. Because I was always committing an action, whether it be setting cards, whether it be trying to extend the game state. That's another thing I would do is I would simply set monsters in game two, and that's not slow playing. That's just playing the game. And even if I think that I couldn't win, I would play as many cards as I could. And then I would get to that last game three where I am simply dominant in those scenarios. And so my message to you, the viewers, is you could have your opinion about winning in time because there's a lot of decks that do it. Gookie did it with the Gaga Cowboy. Pendulums could do it as well with certain cards. Rockets did it with Scarlight, whether they cited in Scarlight to win in time. And now, lo and behold, you have a card called Cyber Angel Natasha. and that card gains life points in time as well. So be prepared to lose to a Drytron player in the last minute or so, because that's what I'm trying to do. So if you don't have a plan, you're just gonna lose, and it sucks that it's that way, but you have to have a game plan one way or the other. What do you
Yeah,
think about this?
you bring up a really interesting point here, that slow playing is not the same thing as strategically using the clock as an alternate win condition. Now, what exactly do we mean by that? You mentioned that you're making plays, and the Konami definition of slow playing is to not commit actions in a timely fashion. So if you're setting cards, if you're summoning monsters, or if people have definitely rushed me before, where I was definitely playing, like, I was playing Subterra against, I think it was Sky Striker, and I had Imperial Order up, so it was in their best interest to rush me through my turn so that it would burn me faster than I could
Right.
kill them. But the fact is, you
Correct.
have
And
a reasonable amount of time to commit any action in any game state. Don't take 30 seconds to think about an action, but 10 to 15 seconds per action is, I would say, pretty reasonable.
right.
A lot of
And I
times that would
understand.
just be like, just go, 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 go. But you need to have
Right.
a reasonable amount of time to actually make a play. And that's not slow playing. That is just playing the game. So watching the clock and being aware of time will definitely work in your favor. We definitely in no way condone, taking 2 minutes to make a turn, or taking 7 minutes to side when you're only allowed 3 minutes. We definitely do not condone that, for sure.
Right. And I to build on to that point, I think that rushing people is almost just as bad as slow playing, because
Absolutely.
people who are rushing people are equally as um, malevolent. They want to abuse the time rules. So there's no difference between slow playing and rushing your opponent. Now, it's one thing if they're taking forever. If they're taking forever, you simply call a judge and they get a warning and you move on. But there are people who have rushed me to make an action, and I'm not gonna lie, that just makes me want to take my time longer, because I will not be rushed just for my opponent's benefit. And I've told my opponent, like, they tell me, "Can you play faster?" I tell them no. So I always say that I play at my own pace, and my pace is usually very fair. It's always, again, I never play slower than my opponent. If my opponent's taking 5 minutes to set 5 cards, and I'm going to take 5 minutes to play my prank kid combo, whether it be thinking on what prank kid to summon, because I have to play around Nibiru, I have to play around Ghostbell, I have to play around Skullmeister, I have to play around Ash, I have to play around Gamma. Do you think it's easy? It's not. So I'm not just slow playing. There's sometimes where you actually think of like what you have to do, and even though you do it 1,000 times, it's never the same. There's always unique circumstances. You have to make reads, and the good players don't understand that. The great players do. So I would like to think of myself evolving as a player, and I got a lot of flack, and I felt bad about myself. But as I reflect upon this experience of going to locals and pissing people off with my strategy, I just have to say tough, like you guys, beat me. That's how you stop me from winning. So
Don't get mad, get good.
right, don't hate the player, hate the game.
Yeah, I mean, it's up to Konami to fix these, as most people would consider, very toxic time rules. But until that gets fixed, somebody has to benefit from it. And again,
Right.
we're not saying to benefit from it in a toxic way, but be cognizant of the clock. And that doesn't mean rush your opponent. That doesn't mean take forever to make a play. That just means be aware how much time is left, and be aware what you could lose to, or what could provide an alternate win condition.
Exactly. 100%. And like for instance, if you're in time and you're playing against say Drytron and they have a Natasha engrave and they activate Mediana and you have a ghost spell, whereas usually you would probably save it for like the alpha, you're probably ghost spelling the Medianus, unless they have Fafnir in which you can't negate it. But you're usually ghost spelling the Medianus to summon the card that can lose you the game. So to end the segment on sort of like a positive note, because we're talking about time rules, I always like to tell this story. So the first ever event after we got this updated time rule, I don't know if you were there, but it was YCS Secaucus, New Jersey. Were
I
you at
was
this
there
event?
actually.
Awesome. So round one, there was this is the first event with the new time rules. I think it was being streamed, if I'm not mistaken, and a lot of people were tuning in to like see how the new time rules would progress. And I watched a game where I'm not going to name names, but there was a Trickstar player involved, and he went to our locals in Flushing, and he was playing Trickstars, and I forgot what his opponent was playing. I want to say it was either Invoked or Spirals, and it was a deck that added a lot of cards. So the Trickstar player had to use the little duelist room. He had to go to the bathroom, and there was like a minute left. There was like 30 seconds left on the clock, and they paused. I guess they had a judge officiate the entire thing, but they paused time just for them. The Trickstar duelist went to the bathroom, like tried to hurry up, like took 5 minutes, came back. The round was over for everyone else in the room. It was just them playing, so the entire room was watching them. And he comes back, his opponent like normal summons an Alistair, like adds a card, and then like the Trickstar player goes, normal summons a Candina or a Candina, search Licorice, tag out, summon Licorice, passes turn, 2 seconds left on the clock, opponent draws a card, and the Trickstar player won. I'm like, wow, if that's what it takes, I couldn't. Like, I knew that once that these time rules were going to take effect, that something like that would happen, and it happened round one of the very first event, and I was dying. I thought it was hilarious.
Yeah, that was actually the breakout event for Trickstar Sky Striker, if I remember correctly.
Yes, a lot of good players. I remember I played Max Reynolds, Jeff Jones' boyfriend, and he was on it, and he beat me in time with Trisbania. I let him take back a play. I think he let me take back a play earlier in the match, so I had to let him take back one and let him summon Trisbania. And all in all, it was a good fight. So GG to Max Reynolds. But anyway, that'll lead us into our final segment of the show. So we usually do a little Road of the King action here. So I'm going to quarterback this one, if you don't mind. We got creation and innovation. So this is a short segment from Patrick Hoban's book on page 249 for those reading at home. And I'm gonna start off with a little bit of a quote from Peter Thiel, and this is in Patrick Hoban's book, but it's from the original book is called 0 to 1, which is a book that I actually picked up and started reading. So it's quite an interesting read for those who are interested in business and technology and things like that. So creation and innovation is the title of the segment, and it starts with a quote that says, "Doing what we already know how to do takes the world from 1 to n meaning the number of changes, adding more of something familiar. But every time we create something new, we go from 0 to 1. The act of creation is singular, as is the moment of creation, and the result is something fresh and strange." So Patrick Hoban obviously applies this to Yu-Gi-Oh! And talks about innovation within the community. And he talks about if you're following the curve, then you're probably behind. And believe it or not, when I was in college, I actually wrote a paper on the Yu-Gi-Oh! Community in general, and I cited Patrick Hoban's book as a secondary source. And this was back when the book first came out. So Patrick Hoban loved the paper was like 20 pages, but I actually talked about this a lot because a controversial issue when Yu-Gi tubing got big was the issue of net decking, right? So people
Right.
don't really talk about it as much now, but when Patrick Hoban and Jeff Jones were the better players, a lot of people would just net deck their YCS first place or ARG first place deck profile. And people said, oh, that's toxic. Like, you have to change a card, otherwise you're a toxic player. Whereas now, if say Hani or someone puts out a list, we encourage it. There's Dual Academy where you could pay to take someone's list, which granted it's a business, but still pretty much net decking. And a lot of people do it, which is fine, because when we talk about 0 to 1, when we're copying someone's content card for card, whether it be the deck profile card for card, then we're behind because those players are already creating something new. They're going from we're going from 1 to n. Say we make a slight change on the deck, we're going from 1 to n, where they're going from 0 to 1 because they're starting something like they're starting from scratch and they're starting a new idea for the next format. It might look similar, but the theory is different because the format always changes. So I do want to talk about a little how I think that it's important for people to try to go from 0 to 1 themselves. Now, obviously, we want to go based off of sound theory and theory that applies to the format in a particular way. But at the same time, I think that there's a lot of people that just go out there and play with standard, and it can get people some success, whether it be at the local level or even the regional level. But I think, in my opinion, when I look at a YCS caliber player where they're consistently doing well, they're always doing something new. I think that someone who does this very well is Cody Angeloff. Usually he's playing something very fresh and new, and he's doing something that's innovative. And same thing with Jesse Cotton. Obviously, they're premier players. So where do you stand on this? Do you think that going from 0 to 1 makes you a better player? Or do you think it's more useful to just start from 1 and go to n and live with the mediocre success that you'll get with that?
Well, it's honestly a bit of a tough thing because the fact of the matter is that the best players are definitely going to be very few, right? There's only so many Jesse Cottons and Cody Angeloffs and Patrick Hobans in the world. And so for the vast majority of players, it's going to have to be enough to see a winning deck list and maybe make their own changes, but I don't think we should be so precious about it, right? It's completely fine in my book if you were to look at a winning deck list, make a few changes, maybe adjust for your locals or maybe adjust for what you think the anticipated meta is going to be. But I think for the vast majority of players, the act of creation is extremely difficult. And most players are going to take, like a lot of players take creativity, putting that in air quotes, to just be bad ideas. A lot of players just really aren't good at figuring out like what solid good theory is. And that's what actually separates the best players from mediocre or even average or above average players. Like the legendary players are the ones who are able to set the trends. And I think that's why net decking exists. Honestly, that for there's a few who pave the
Yeah,
way, lead the way, and everyone follows. And occasionally you might be someone who comes up with a great idea, but not all ideas are created equal, and it's hard to come up with a good idea. It's
right.
a lot easier to become competent with technical play than it is to come up with some crazy new idea that just might work. I remember in YCS Chicago, everyone was expecting Altergeist, Sky Striker. Nobody, except for a handful of people, saw the Danger Thunder combo strategy coming. And even more than that, nobody saw the Lunalight Danger OTK, like Edasepsion called it just like the attack deck. Nobody saw that coming either. Those were two like wildly different decks that kind of use similar theories, but had completely different end goals. And that's part of the reason that those decks were so successful is that nobody saw them coming. They were just like completely, as you said, like strange and new and fresh, and nobody knows how to deal with those things. They become less effective once people have adjusted to them and have learned them, and they're no longer strange and fresh. And so that's really where like the cutting edge of competitive success in Yu-Gi-Oh comes from in a lot of ways. So I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah. Well, I agree. I think that what I wrote in my paper still pretty much holds true. Those who are new to the community and literally starting from zero, talk from 0 to 1, these people are just trying to grasp the concepts of the game. And usually when that happens, I tell someone to go and play the most standard before I tell people to play like Salmon Greats. And now I tell people to play like Virtual World, like very cookie cutter decks that do one thing really well. and you can learn the intricacies of a format very smoothly. However, when you start to get to that intermediate level of where you're going to locals and you're doing, maybe getting top 8 or top 4 at like a 20-man locals, then maybe you're intermediate, but you're not winning those locals yet. I would say the best way you could do that is to just fail a lot. And I, consider myself a above average player, and I failed a lot. Like I remember, I would come with my own ideas. I played like Shadal Cosmos when the deck first came out, and I thought it was the wave. It wasn't the wave, but I thought it was good. I convinced myself it was good. I thought I was like Patrick Hoban 2.0 playing it, and it wasn't. Like it just wasn't good. There were certain ideas that even recently, like I put some ideas out there that just flat out weren't good. I thought they were, but they weren't. And there's no shame in that. I think that I like to see people, like when I see someone come up to me and there's an idea where it's clearly not a good idea, I entertain it because I respect that they came up with it and they put time into it and they're trying to think left and right, whereas everyone else is trying to think up and down. So there's this model of thinking called design thinking that I learned in college from an outside professor. And lo and behold, Patrick Hoban's company also uses it now to think of bigger and better ideas of how to improve their brand. And it's basically coming up with crazy ideas, trying to force connections, and making something useful out of it. And the only rule is that you can't say no to an idea. So it's useful if two people sit in a room and they say, well, what if we played Altergeist cards in the Drytron deck? Like that makes no sense. But out of that logic, like out of that way of thinking, you can come up with maybe there's a good trap that you could play that's maybe played in Altergeist, but would be really good in Drytron or something. That's just like a random example. But that's the way innovators think, right? In Yu-Gi-Oh! And that's the way I try to think. Now, what I will say to get my final thought on this matter is that I think it's important to look at previous deck profiles from other formats. And what I mean by this is when I did well with Thunder Dragons, I actually looked at Patrick Hoban's Mermail deck profile from ARG Raleigh 2013. And it just had a great mixture of starters, extenders, bombs, and the format was similar to the current format because the best deck then was Dragon Rulers, and the best deck when Thunder Dragons was out was Orcust. So I consider those very two decks similar. And there was also like a trap deck, like I don't know, I think it was Dino Rabbit or something like that. And it was a similar format. So I just looked at what he did and what the cards did and what those cards accomplished. And I said, mathematically, I'm going to do the same thing. Obviously, the cards are completely different, but the roles those cards filled were similar. And so you could take the same ideologies from your predecessors, but apply it in different ways. And that's what makes a good duelist a great duelist.
Absolutely. And I think I think we've just about exhausted this topic, but I've had a really great time back here in the driver's seat once again on the Shadow Realm podcast. I want to thank you all again for tuning in, and definitely look forward to a lot more episodes. Go ahead.
Right. Oh, before we go, we just want to shout out that we have a little coaching system going, and it's through Bemani Lounge. And essentially what we're doing is for $5 a month, we're offering a coaching service where we have a group chat, we talk to you, we have one-on-one service, we coordinate it very organized, and we go through Dueling Book and we help you through Discord voice chats. And it's a cheaper alternative to Duelist Academy, but it's no knockoff because we also allow the players that do the best to graduate and be sponsored by Team Lionheart, which is the official team of Bemani Lounge. And if any of you out there are listening, whether it be the day after this is released or whether it be a month after, look into it. Contact us on Facebook. Go through Bemani Lounge, or you can contact me or Zach and give us a message. We'll get you involved. And for only $5 a month, you could start as a good duelist and graduate to being a premier duelist. So look from Bemani Lounge, and look out for our EDL Pro tournaments as well.
Absolutely. We are going to be hitting big in the year 2021. So, yeah, thanks for that, Henry. And thank
Yep.
you again for tuning in to another episode of the Shadow Realm podcast. This is your co host, Zack Alder, signing off. Good luck. Have fun, duelists. And we will see you in the next episode.